Hello guys and welcome back to Let Me Teach You. Last time we talked about the East Germanic branch and the Gothic language. In today's video we're going to move to the north to see how the North Germanic branch emerged from Proto-Germanic before splitting into the modern North Germanic languages. So, are you ready? Let's start! The northern branch is the branch of the Vikings, people who used to bathe in dragon's blood to achieve immortality, and who also used to wear horn helmets. No, both of these things are false. The former is a legend told in the Nibelungenlied, the latter just fake news. Tell a lie 1,000 times, it will become truth. They were very good at sailing. So by the 8th century, some of these pirates started organizing missions aimed at conquering the Western Islands, like Iceland, the Faroe Islands, the Shetland and Orkney Islands, parts of Scotland and Greenland. As they also settled in some of these areas for a long time, their language, the Old Norse language, started spreading and splitting into different dialects. Originally, they believed in violent gods like Odin and Thor, whose names we find still today in the days of the week. Later on, they converted to Christianity and started using the Latin alphabet, the one we find in literature. Mostly sagas, that is, long stories where they reconstructed the history of their folk, sometimes with some fictional elements. The word saga comes from the same root of say, and not only fights between humans and monsters were told, but also about saints and bishops, like Olav's Saga, which celebrates the most important Viking saint. The richest source for Norse and Germanic mythology are the two works called Edda, two 13th century books commonly distinguished as the prose or younger Edda and the poetic or elder Edda. Actually, the Church tried to discourage the preservation of texts of heathen tradition. That's why the Gothic heroic literature, that was the richest one among the Germanic peoples, was completely lost. The Norse tradition, and mostly the Icelandic one, only partially survived. But this channel is about linguistics, so our question is, what was the language of the Vikings? In fact, before starting focusing on the single modern Germanic languages, we're trying to analyze the peculiarities that are typical of each one of the three branches. As we have no significant traces of a Proto-Eastern language, but only a work written in the only attested language of that branch, Gothic, in our last video we decided to focus on that language. In the case of the northern branch, we have a common language called Proto-Norse or Ancient Scandinavian that had already split from Proto-Germanic, in a period between 2nd and 7th century when all the people in a certain area, that is the southern Scandinavian peninsula and Denmark, could communicate with each other with no significant dialectal differences. Of this stage we have today hundreds of runic inscriptions, which are very important, as they are the oldest evidence we have of Germanic languages. But at the same time, we're talking about just scattered and fragmentary sentences that don't give us the chance to draw detailed information about the linguistic structures. Basically, we can say that North Germanic people were the only ones who decided to stay in the same area where the Proto-Germanic language was originally spoken, while, as we have already seen, the Eastern folks made their way to the southeast and the Western people moved to the west and to the British Islands. In the 7th century, we start to notice some linguistic differences between West and East Scandinavian that lead us to a new stage called Old Scandinavian. Eastern Old Scandinavian was spoken in today's Sweden and Denmark, while the Western Old Scandinavian in the Norwegian fjords, and later in the Western Islands conquered by the Vikings. West Scandinavian is commonly called Old Norse, and that's the variety of Old Scandinavian of which we preserve the most literature today. Even if this language represents only the western side of the Scandinavian languages, we can take it as a good example to understand features that are common to all the northern branch, even Swedish and Danish, that derive from Eastern Old Scandinavian. just because by that time the differences between the language spoken, say, in Iceland and the one spoken in Denmark were very small. We can't even speak about two different languages. By the 12th century, the same Old Norse speakers used one only name for the language, that is Dansk Tunga. The Old Scandinavian and Old Norse period ended in the 14th century. By this time, new languages started to arise, and these are the modern North Germanic languages. So, talking about Proto-Norse and Old Norse, what was the alphabet people used? Well, if we talk about Proto-Norse, we talk about runic inscriptions. These were written in Elder Futhark. Younger Futhark, the simplified version we already talked about in video number 8, was used for inscriptions in the Old Norse period, starting from the 8th century. With the conversion to Christianity, by the 10th, 11th century, texts in Latin alphabet start to be written. Old Norse alphabet was founded mostly on the Old English adaptation of the Latin alphabet. But the scribes who wrote Old Norse used different variants in orthography. In order to avoid confusion, most Old Norse texts today can be read in a standardized writing that uses acute accents for long vowels. O with the so-called agonic attached to the bottom of the symbol is used to distinguish O from O. Slashed O and the ligature of O and E are used for short and long U. U. A ligature of A and E for long E sound. Thorn and eth are usually used in order to express the sounds th and the, double letters for geminate consonant sounds, that is with longer duration. In some sources you can find the same for long vowels, instead of the acute accent. But the alphabet is just a means to express the sounds of a language. So the next question is, what were the sounds of Proto-Norse and Old Norse? When we talk about the sounds of a language in the past, we always have to remember that we certainly had differences in space and time. Old Norse spoken in Iceland was not exactly the same as the one spoken in the Norwegian fjords, and the language spoken in the 8th century was different from the one used in the 12th century. Furthermore, what we imagine to have been the pronunciation of languages that were not recorded on tape is just a reconstruction, imperfect by definition. That's why we have to be careful when we talk about phonetics and phonology. Scholars today have two official ways to pronounce Old Norse: the modern Icelandic way and the reconstructed pronunciation. It's pretty much the same we do today with Latin. We have the ecclesiastical pronunciation, close to the Italian one, and the restored pronunciation, a reconstruction of the sounds of classical Latin. The Icelandic pronunciation doesn't match at all with the way Vikings used to speak, as Icelandic has undergone several sound changes since the Middle Ages. That's why we're going to ignore it. We will use the reconstructed one, which, as for all dead languages, will never give us pure certainties, but at least we have reliable phonological and comparative studies and also a document, the Fyrsta Málfræðiritgerðin, or First Grammatical Treatise, from the 12th century, that provides us with useful information about the way people spoke by that time. There are some interesting phonological elements that already characterize the Proto-Norse stage. For example, it looks like in this early language stage all vowels were pretty similar to those of Proto-Germanic. Please note that long e became long a, unlike Gothic but similarly to West Germanic. Vowels could also be nasalized, usually in case of vowels preceding a Germanic nasal consonant that had already disappeared. But these nasal vowels are not today usually taken into consideration, at least as distinctive elements, in Old Norse, even though recorded until the 12th century. Some mutations began to take place, like metaphony, but in this stage the resulting sounds, like u or u, were just allophones, that is, variants of other vowel sounds, not distinctive, independent sounds. This is why the Proto-Norse vowel system is supposed to be something like this. Already by this stage, Proto-Germanic y was lost word initially. Thus we have ar, year, from Proto-Germanic jeran.
I know you're crying because this sound was lost. But don't worry about that, because the U sound was reintroduced later as a result of another mutation.
W as well was lost in front of stressed labial vowels. See wolf, wolf, from Proto-Germanic wolfas. In the younger Futhark of Proto-Norse, there was a rune, ur, derived from alges, that corresponds to the Proto-Germanic sound z. In Old Norse, this sound will merge with r, but not yet in Proto-Norse, as we have two different symbols. Probably it was something in the middle, maybe a laminal alveolar sound, like z, that also triggered front umlaut. In Old Norse, the vowel system had changed a little. As you can see, most vowels still have a short and a long counterpart, except a, that is always long, because short a had already merged with e. A was only short because the long version had merged with a, not later than the 13th century. In fact, the letter had developed lip rounding, becoming something like a or o. Metaphony, in this case front mutation, introduced two new vowels in the system. The front rounded vowels u and u, that were not only allophones, but distinctive sounds that could change the meaning of a word. For example, we have Proto-Germanic fotis, Old Norse futr. O, influenced by I, switched to its front counterpart, Ö. But then I disappeared, leaving Ö alone, marking the difference from the singular fots, foot. The loss of unstressed vowels, called syncopation, is a typical feature of the transition from Proto-Norse to Old Norse. That specific kind of metaphony called front mutation or I umlaut, together with U umlaut, which for example transformed A to O, all the times the former precedes U in the next syllable, like in dag, day, that becomes dogum in the dative plural, were the ones that had the most visible consequences also for morphology. Third kind of metaphony, A umlaut, opening for example U to O, had weaker effects. See for example nedan, from below, related to neither, below. Also breaking affects vowels. There is a so-called up-breaking and a up-breaking. In the first stage, the resulting broken diphthongs were falling diphthongs, whereby the stress was located on the first of the two vocalic elements, while later they would develop into rising diphthongs, the first sound becoming a glide y, and the second one bearing the stress. Example of up-breaking is Proto-Germanic herto, heart, switched to a first stage of Proto-Norse to herta, with stress on e, and then Old Norse hjarta. Example of u-breaking is Proto-Germanic ertho, earth, Proto-Norse erthu, Old Norse jorth.
And here we find that initial U that you were missing so much.
Three diphthongs survive in Old Norse: I, O, O. The first two from Proto-Germanic I and Au, whereby the first sound was slightly modified by the second one. The third diphthong is Au, affected by front metaphony. Diphthongs were soon monophthongized, that is, merged in just one vowel sound, in the eastern area, into respectively e, u, u. But that didn't happen in Old Norse. And what about consonants? Basically, we have three main articulation points: labial, dental, velar, while labio-velar survived only in the w glide. For each of these positions, there is a voiceless plosive, a voiced plosive, and a voiceless fricative. Voiced fricatives can be considered allophones of the voiceless ones, when these are not in the beginning of a word. In fact, f and v are both written using the letter F. See fe, cattle or money, and hava, to have. The same distribution exists for th and th, even though two different letters were used. See thrir, 3, and bjoda, to offer, to invite. H survived only as a glottal h in beginning of words and disappeared completely in other positions. We've already seen this in fe from Proto-Germanic fehu. We still find the voice counterpart g, but it's an allophone of the velar plosive g, not of h or h, as we can see in dahr, day. Anyway, the aforementioned process of phonological merging of voiceless and voiced fricatives, and also the introduction of analogy, that is a regularization of patterns that were not anymore seen as regular, caused the disappearing of the effects of Werner's law. See the verb sova, to sleep. The paradigm of sova is sova, suav, suavu, sovin. This shows the alternation between voiceless and voiced fricatives is no longer in evidence. To complete the consonant system, we have n, m, s, r, l, y, w, that we already find in Proto-Germanic. R could also be the result of rhotacism. See höra, to hear, from Proto-Germanic hausianon. Another typical phenomenon of Old Norse is assimilation, which we can easily spot in word endings. Where Proto-Germanic z became Old Norse r, that was eventually assimilated by the root, like in stol, table, from stolr, or madr, man, from manr. Another phenomenon we have already talked about in Gothic is Verschärfung. Proto-Germanic geminate y and w become g and gu, like in twegja, the genitive of two. The consonant is longer and produced using more energy. Sound length affected also syllable length. Stressed syllables could be of different duration. They could be short or long, like in many other languages, but also overlong, when a long vowel and a geminate consonant or a consonant cluster were found in the same syllable. Example, note, night.
Sunrise, sunset, sunrise, sunset.
And what about accent and tone? Well, the accent, like in Proto-Germanic, was on the root and most often on the first syllable. According to most scholars, Old Norse had a stress accent like Proto-Germanic and not a pitch one. But some other scholars also proposed that a pitch accent was present, which eventually evolved into some typical features of modern North Germanic languages, like tonal accent in Swedish and Norwegian. See the difference between bönner and bönner. According to most scholars, instead, these modern features were introduced in relatively modern times and depends on whether words were originally bisyllabic or monosyllabic. And what about morphology?
Of course, even the way words were structured comes straight from Proto-Germanic, but some of the aspects of Germanic were simplified. For example, dual, that we could still find in Gothic, as you can remember, even in the verb conjugation, is present in Old Norse only in the two pronouns of first and singular person.
Only 4 of the 6 Germanic cases survived, but endings were less differentiated and lots of them merged, causing confusion. See, for example, bok, book. We have the same form for nominative, accusative, and dative singular, or also we have the same form for genitive singular, nominative plural, and accusative plural. In Old Norse we still have 3 genders. They are inflected in different ways, but it's not always easy to guess the gender of a word at a first glance. The weakening and loss of unstressed vowels created confusion in noun classes. That's why it's maybe not necessary to mention all the classes we listed in video number 6. We can just distinguish between strong and weak nouns. The former derived mostly from the noun classes with vocalic stem of Proto-Germanic, the latter, with even less differentiated endings, from the old N stem. While for nouns the difference between strong and weak declension is just a matter of endings and not of meaning, and each noun can only be inflected according to one of the 2 desinents set. This is not true for adjectives. that could be indefinite, strong, or definite, weak, according to the context, being thus inflected in two different ways. Compare ríkr konungr, a powerful king, with in ríki konung, the powerful king. Adjectives and adverbs can be expressed also in comparative and superlative degrees, using the desinences ar or r and ast or st from Proto-Germanic iso, istas, which also triggered sometimes I umlaut. See spakr, spakari, spakastr, wise, wiser, the wisest, langr, lengri, lengstr, long, longer, the longest.
While in Gothic we have seen that a proper article hadn't been introduced yet, this is not the case of Old Norse.
In this language, the demonstrative pronoun hin is used as a definite article, or in some other cases, mostly when the noun is not accompanied by an adjective, it is postponed and then partially assimilated by the noun it refers to, creating somehow a double declension for each word, with or without suffixed article. See the difference between nominative plural fötr, which means feet, but the feet is fötrnir. In genitive plural we have fötr, fötrna respectively, in genitive singular fótar, fótarins, and so on.
Even though we have it in Old Norse, we have to say that the definite article is used more sparingly than in modern English. It is regularly omitted, for example, for nouns that denote something very familiar to the writer or to the reader.
See, for example, the following sentence. Konungr ward reiður mjokk. The king became very angry, where the word konungr in Old Norse is indefinite, even though we know who the king is. Numerals are mostly not inflected. Only numbers from 1 to 4 can be inflected at least for case and gender. When it comes to 100 and 1000, we find a double meaning. The first one is the meaning we give today. The second one corresponds to 120 or 1200 respectively, a relic of an old duodecimal system. Usually this difference is not really important anyway, because high numbers are used with general or metaphorical meaning. When it comes to verbs, they are conjugated in the usual 3 persons, 2 numbers, dual survives only in pronouns, 3 finite moods, indicative, subjunctive, and imperative, plus infinitive and participle, 2 tenses, present and past, and we find the introduction of many analytic forms, like to express perfect and past perfect with the verbs hava, to have, or wera, to be, conjugated, plus past participle of the verb. See, for example, sumir men segja at han havi fallit. Some men say that he has fallen. Or to introduce some future forms, using munu, which doesn't mean anything, it's just a verb used to express the meaning of future, plus infinitive. Mun fadir min doth wera, my father will be dead. Or to express the passive voice, with wera, to be, or werda, to become, plus past participle, like in Ward engi uppreist I moti konungi gor, no rebellion was made against the king. Another way to introduce a passive or mediopassive or reciprocal voice was introduced in this branch. It consisted in an SK ending to be added to the active desinences, from the reflexive pronoun sic, or from the pronoun mik, only for the first singular person. A hans dogum bugdisk Island. In his days, Iceland was settled.
Both speaking about nouns and verbs, mutations like metaphony or breaking created a complex system where the same word can change its root vowel several times in the same conjugation or declension.
In nouns, sometimes the original non-mutated vowel is not to be found in nominative as one would expect, because of the r metaphony, like in kur, cow, which has u in the nominative, but whose original root vowel can be found in the accusative and dative singular, ku. In other cases, we can find up to 3 different root variants in the same declension. See orn, ego, that alternates o, a, e, or fara, to go, that alternates a, e, o in the present and o, u in the past. Even the ablaut system in strong verbs is harder to recognize in Old Norse. We can still spot the vocalic alternation of the first 6 classes, while the 7th class lost completely its typical feature, that is, reduplication. Weak verbs also exist, and as we know, they have no ablaut and use a dental suffix for the past forms. Ek kalada, I called, ek walda, I chose, ek wakta, I was awake. Pronouns are usually expressed. They are also inflected in the 4 cases. Among these, the dual pronouns, wit and it or thit. Those used for the 3rd singular and plural person can also be inflected for gender. See thair, thar, tho. First singular person and 2nd singular person can also be postponed and suffixed to the verb. Thuis kaltu haita mer. You must promise me that.
With the weakening of the inflectional forms, prepositions become more and more important. Some of them can be used with different cases according to the context.
For example, eptir orrostuna with accusative after the battle indicates time, while han raith eptir thaim, he rode after them, indicates motion in space. Old Norse developed as well a rich system of conjunctions. Interesting is the absence of relative pronouns, filled by the use of a so-called complementizer, er, which is uninflected and often accompanied by other adverbs or pronouns in order to make its meaning clearer. Example, Gud heyrir bönir varar, hvar ver biðjum fyrir oss af ollu hjarta. God hears our prayers wherever we pray from our whole heart. In this case, where means literally something like where that we.
Speaking about conjunctions allows us to move to the next topic, that is syntax.
Usually we have a trend. Before we talk about this trend, we have to distinguish between, on one side, analytic languages, like modern English, that prefer to express morphological meanings, like past tense or possession, for example, by means of particles, like prepositions or auxiliary words. And, on the other side, synthetic languages, like Latin or also Proto-Germanic, that use to express the functions of the words, mostly by a complex system of inflections. See the difference between English, I will be seen, where the 4 meanings of I, future, passive, and to see are expressed separately, and Latin videbor. Analytic languages usually need a strict word order, otherwise you can mistake, for example, the subject for the object, that are usually expressed with the same form. For example, if you say in English, John slaps Patrick, it's clear that John is the one who is slapping and Patrick the person being slapped. But it's important to follow this order, for if you say Patrick slaps John, you mean the opposite, and you end up in a slapping contest. Old Norse, even though in a process of transformation from a pure synthetic language, like Proto-Germanic was, to a less synthetic one, in fact endings are not so clearly differentiated as before, has a relatively free word order. We can say Olofr saw, konu thaw ina gomlu, or konu thaw ina gomlu saw Olafr. It will always mean that Olaf saw the old woman. But still, as we already said, they needed to start making a larger use of particles like prepositions. Or for example, they usually had to express the subject pronouns. To say I didn't tell you that, even if the verb is already inflected according to the person and cannot be confused with other forms, they usually express the subject pronoun as well. Aigi sagda ek ther that.
Usually there is less flexibility for what concerns the position of a verb. They are usually in the first or second place in main clauses, both declarative and interrogative, but almost always after the subject in dependent clauses.
This way, the sentence "Síðan gekk hann til messu" is to be interpreted as a main clause, with verb gekk in the second place preceding the subject hann, he, thus meaning "then he went to Mass", while "síðan hann gekk til messu" with the verb after the subject is to be interpreted as a dependent sentence, that is, since he went to Mass. Sometimes you can find a certain distance between connected elements in the same sentence, and this is something I really hated when I studied Latin at school, but still, inflectional agreement helps us connect words, even if they're not close to each other. See, Góðan eigum ver konung, we have a good king, literally good have we king.
Talking about my memories from school, there is another structure that Old Norse has in common with Latin and Greek, and it's what we called dative absolute. In Latin we had the so-called ablative absolute, and in ancient Greek we had the genitive absolute, but it's more or less the same thing. In Old Norse we have a noun in the dative case plus a participle in agreement that are used together to replace a temporal sentence. That's what we would translate in English with when, as, and so on.
See, þessum 13 útgengnum varu aðrir 13 in leiðir. When these 13 had gone out, another 13 were led in. The literal translation would be, with these 13 gone out, another 13 were led in.
Another feature that I found very interesting in Old Norse is that we have some verbs whose logical subject is not in the nominative case, but in the accusative or in the dative case.
This is the case, for example, of þykir mér, it seems to me, whereby the person having the impression is in dative in Old Norse and is governed by the preposition to in English. But it's also the case of drauma, the dream, with the double accusative, the one referring to the person that is dreaming and the other one to the object of the dream. See, Ragnhildi drottning drömde drauma stora, Queen Ragnhild dreamt great dreams. There's no grammatical subject in this sentence. Notice that in both examples we're talking about verbs, like to seem or to dream, describing actions that are not under full control of the performer.
We're coming to the end of the video, but before we say goodbye, it's important to have a look as well at the vocabulary of the language.
Of course, words are mostly the direct evolution of Germanic roots. The earliest loanwords that we know come from neighboring languages the Vikings were in contact with. For example, botr, boat, from Frisian or Old English, or sometimes Latin and Greek words, some of them introduced with the conversion to Christianity, very often filtered by English and German, such as strati, street, Latin strata, or kyrkia, church, from Greek kyriakon. Many new words are loan shifts, where a native word has had its content modified to perform the same function as a corresponding foreign word. This happened, for example, to the word for Christmas, jól, that was before the name of an old Germanic festival. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, in the latest stage of Old Norse, or when the modern languages had already emerged, a strong lexical influence was brought by Low German. Not only on the vocabulary, but the structures were strongly simplified, as an effect of the large number of foreign speakers, who contributed to the simplification of language structures and created a new simple Norse with less inflectional features. Furthermore, some new grammatical words were successfully introduced, such as men, but, and bli, to stay, to become, which eventually took on the role of passive auxiliary, replacing the Scandinavian verda in many dialects.
But this is another story. I have to leave you now. Please share the video if you liked it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and to click on the bell icon as well if you want to be part of this fabulous world. That's it for the moment. See you and behave yourselves.